It's the 31st of December 2022 today, and here's the annual book review, a little spontaneous summary. Novels, I read Hideo Yokoyama's novel 17. It is actually about the world's biggest single aircraft crash, which happened in the 1980s in Japan, and 520 people died. This is written from the perspective of a reporter of a newspaper that covered this crash. And I would say it's a really good read. I think I gave it 4.5 out of 5. So it had me reading. Then I read a few novels in German. I started with Marlen Haushofer, Drivet. She was an Austrian author. This is called The Wall in English. And it's quite famous. I was recommended it by Drax in the Second Life book club. And there are supernatural elements in it, but it's also sort of a low-key thriller. A little bit too low-key for me, actually, because it gets a bit boring sometimes, but it's a very special book, and I'm happy that I read it. Another book in German, Hubert Fichte, Der kleine Hauptbahnhof oder Lob des Strichs. This takes place in the early 1960s in Hamburg, and the author, he died of AIDS-related diseases in 1986. He was born in 1935, so this is it's very autobiographical. It was not published during his lifetime, and it is about a young gay man who fights his way up in the cultural hierarchy in West Germany in the early 1960s when he was in his 20s. This is very relatable for me, actually, and it's a mix of these high-profile personas like Enzensberger, Günter Grass, and similar authors, as well as big publishers like Rowohlt and Suhrkamp. These big names. I think that the German cultural landscape is so huge, so big and imposing compared to the Swedish one. But in any case, it's a mixture of that on the one hand, and on the other hand of gay sexual things that made this one remind me a lot of Michal Witkowski's Lubiewo. So it is almost ethnographic in that sense, and that makes it a very interesting book. I also didn't like it so much in other parts, but all in all, I'm happy I read it. And the third and last book in German that I read was Michael Ende, Die unendliche Geschichte, or The Neverending Story, as it is called in English. I watched the film as a child, but I didn't remember anything from it except for this hairy dragon. But now I read it, I guess I was feeling down when I read it as well, so it meant a lot to me, and this theme of imagination and the border between the actual reality and the reality that we imagine, and the transcendence of that border. This is the main theme of this book, and that makes it very special to me. There are other themes as well, such as friendship and love, but the main theme of imagination makes this book a Bible in my life, I would say. I devoured it in a few days, and I'm really happy that I finally read it. This year was also when I sort of rediscovered science fiction. I started with a book by Philip K. Dick, my first Dick, The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. And this is almost in the same vein almost as The Neverending Story, because it is about different realities, and after a while you don't know in which reality you are. It reminded a bit of David Cronenberg's film Existence in that sense. But okay, let me also introduce Isaac Asimov, my first Asimov, Foundation. This is the first novel in his famous Foundation series. And the funny thing with both these is that, I mean, Foundation was written in 1950, I think, and this one maybe in the 60s. So although both novels take place in space, they remind very much of the USA in the 1950s, with the male characters smoking a lot and doing business and being traveling salesmen and so on, as I imagine people did in the US in the 1950s, which is where these authors lived. Okay, so then I read a novel in Swedish, Drivet, by Daniel Björk. Daniel is a friend of mine, and that's why I read the novel. But I'm really happy that I read it and that I bought it, because it's such a great novel, and I would have thought that even if he was not my friend. I hope that this one will be translated into English soon, because it is, I had expected some gay love story, but it's not. It's a novel of ideas, and I devoured this one as well in only 3 days. It's very nice to read in Swedish, and it's simply such a great. It's cultural critique in the form of a novel. I highly recommend it to everyone. And the last novel of this year is Bryan Washington, Memorial. I think it's quite a talked about book, and I love this one as well. This is a gay love story, by the way, and it's very relatable, and I think that this is an important book, and one that I would recommend to several people, actually. So let's move on to nonfiction. I started, of course, this was the year that I finished the first year of my PhD. So the second semester of my PhD was a lot about reading subject-specific texts. This usually didn't mean full books, rather academic articles, but one book that I thought I should start with is Manga by Frederik Schodt from 1983. This is a classic. It's a very accessible history of manga. And it was super interesting to read. It's like a grounding in the manga business. Its roots, but also its contemporary production, distribution, and readership. So super interesting, really. And then I continued with, since my subject is a certain subgenre of erotic manga, I thought I should read Nagayama Kaoru's book, Manga Studies, as it's called in Japanese. But it has recently come out in English. It's called Erotic Comics in Japan, translated by Jessica Sugimoto and Patrick W. Galbraith. And it's so good. I'm so happy I could finally read it in English. I had only read parts of it in Japanese before. This is, Nagayama is great. I have done a special video only on his book, actually, and also on the next book I read, which is Kimi, Rito, The History of Hentai Manga, an expressionist examination of ero manga. So this is also a book that came out in English this year or last year. Digital Minimalism by Cal Newport. This is the Department of Self-Help, of course. Last year I read his more influential book called Deep Work. This one didn't give me so much more, and the takeaways are quite obvious. I think Deep Work had much more of a message, and Digital Minimalism, you read it, you know what he's going to say, but you still read it and you like it. So that's The Courage to be Disliked by Ichiro Kishimi and Fumitake Koga. I love this book because its main point is that all problems are interpersonal problems. And they introduce the concept of, well, it's not their concept, but the concept of task separation. It means that you should only be focused on your task. Your task is to be you, to do whatever you're doing. And then it's other people's tasks, how they react to that, whether they like it or don't like it. That's none of your business. You don't have to care about that. And once you stop caring about that, it's like the Gordian what was it that Alexander the Great did? You untie the Gordian knot with a sword, and so this was an eye-opener, mainly in personal relationships, like friends, but also in general. And related to that one is Jon Ronson, So You've Been Publicly Shamed. Very interesting book, relatable, but I think that I will do a separate piece on that one. But Ronson shows what drives the haters and what drives the group mentality on Twitter. So it was also eye-opening, actually, and it was good. Then I continued with The Other Victorians by Stephen Marcus, and this one I have recorded a little summary of. This is in order to understand Victorian England and the sexual morals of Victorian England and how they influence us today. So after this one, I continued with James R. Kincaid, which is also a book about Victorian culture and the child in Victorian culture. So this one is also both literary criticism of works published in Victorian England, but also, or maybe mainly, Kincaid applies his analysis on today's society. So it is also very interesting and relevant. What do we have more? Then I switched to finally reading Tom Bulstorff's classic ethnography on Second Life, coming of age in Second Life. All these are library books, by the way, so that's convenient. I like reading on paper now. And this is a book that we read in digital anthropology in my master's program, but we only read the first 2 chapters, so now I read the rest of this book, and I love this book. I think it's Tom Bulstorff's idea of the gap and how the gap can or cannot actually be bridged, and how the idea of the gap, or trying to bridge the gap, actually reinforces the gap. Okay, I realize that this is completely out of context now, but I really like this book. And actually, just now, in the last few days, I read another book on Second Life, Pani Paniscus, Learning to Role-Play in Virtual Worlds. And that is about role-playing in Second Life, but I would actually say that it's more about role-playing in general, maybe role-playing in MMORPGs, or whatever it's called, massively multiple role-playing worlds. Anyway, so it's more about role-playing in general, I think, something that I have never engaged in and that I have never really understood. But this book was a good introduction, if a bit lengthy, to that phenomenon. And he has set it in Second Life. Yeah, so now we come to the manga that I read in 2022. I started by finishing the series of Otaku Yankee Shota to Otaku Onesan by Hoshimi Yumi. And this one is published by Gangan Comics, which is a webcomics company owned by Square Enix, one of the biggest video game companies in the world. And then, because I read this one, I was recommended by Amazon other books that seem to have the same theme. So you could say that I discovered a new genre in this year. So the first 2 books I read were by Ichikawa Natsuo, Namaiki Ritoru Prinsu, The Naughty Little Prince. These are mainstream books, by the way. They are available on Apple Books. And by the same author, Serenade of the Minus Temperature. That's the English title she has given them. And this is a finished series of 3 volumes. So it's from start to finish on the same theme, and a woman who meets a boy. Okay, let me take the last one on that theme as well, which is Koaku Ke JK Nanode Shogakusei o Yuaku? Okay, I'm not sure about the kanji reading there. Shitemasu. This one is also available on Apple Books, and I bought all of them on Japanese Amazon. Well, what can I say but Happy New Year, and see you next year. Bye bye.